So Cassandra, if you know the myth of Cassandra, was straight out of Greek mythology. I'm no expert on Greek mythology, but it's always intrigued me. And there were many different stories to her whole life, but the portion of her life that is very consistent in its story and what's relevant to what I'm going to talk about is that, contrary to what Joe said last night, she could see the future. And can anyone here see the future? No, seriously, there might be a visionary here. There might be somebody who can see the future. They're all over the boardwalk down at the shore. Cassandra was the sister of Helen of Troy, and despite warning the Trojans that they were about to be doomed by the Greeks by the now famous wooden horse, she wasn't believed. Now, adding insult to injury for Cassandra, not only did she have the ability to tell the future, she was always right. And she was cursed with this notion that no one believed her. And that's why we've actually used her as our namesake for the tool that we've developed and I'm going to talk to you about today. So, does this look familiar? Show of hands, quick show of hands. Does anybody here have a facilities master plan? Outstanding. Does anybody, one more show of hands, does anybody have a current facilities master plan? About half the hands, good for you guys. Last one, is anybody following it? About a quarter of the original hands, good for you. The rest of you are like us. And over the last 20 years, we've done 9 comprehensive facilities master plans. We've used 7 different firms, and it's cost us over $1 million, almost $2 million. And great stuff. These are pictures of the various master plans that we've done, and it's really been really helpful to us and very useful to us. But there's a gap there. Why do these things end up being dead-ended? And I would suggest to you that the problem with a comprehensive facilities master plan, for all its benefits, is that it ends up being just that, a static plan. And it's very difficult to update. You don't want to bring the consultant back in. And as soon as you publish it, no matter how glossy the book is, it starts to become out of date. And I think that's the challenge for all of us. So I'm always put in mind of what Eisenhower said on the eve of D-Day when a reporter asked him, will your plan work? Can you imagine being asked that? And his response to that reporter was, the plan is nothing. It's actually the act of planning that matters most. And what I think he meant by that was that the situational awareness that he got from the act of going through the planning process was what gave him the awareness of all the things that could go wrong and how much they mattered to him. And I think that's what we need. That situational awareness, that nimbleness is what we need to create between the master plan and project implementation. And what you're seeing on the screen now is what we call CAS 1.0. CAS is short for Cassandra. And it was developed in our enterprise as an answer to board questions about the context of our $500 million Burger Center for Advanced Pediatric Medicine. It's a building we opened in June. And it's 700,000 square feet of high acuity ambulatory space adjacent to our main hospital. And this was in 2011, and what they asked us was the kinds of questions that are fantastic to get from a board. Is it the right thing to do? Is it in the right place? Are we doing too much of it or too little of it? What are we giving up if we do this? What are we preventing ourselves from doing, either from a cash flow or a real estate basis, from doing that? And we couldn't answer those things. We couldn't give them a context. So this is an animation. It is based on real costs and real time to complete, but it's only an animation. It's a cartoon. And in the upper right-hand corner, you see what I affectionately call our square footometer. And it shows all of the space typologies by percentage, and across the top, you have the actual square footages. In the lower right-hand corner, you see what I affectionately call our bedometer, and it shows you the bed typologies by acuity levels. throughout the enterprise. We have 535 licensed beds in one hospital. We are the academic medical center partner for pediatrics with the University of Pennsylvania. And then the gauge you see in the middle, can you tell I'm a little overly influenced by late night infomercials, right? So the gauge you see in the middle is that, even the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia has cash flow constraints, and you see a cash flow tachometer. So great stuff, extraordinarily descriptive, but done, right? It was an animation, so it wasn't that different than the master plan itself. So what we needed was a tool that would allow us to do more iterative analysis. But of course, we went right into our next master plan. And it was useful, and it was very important to us. We were looking at all the factors that the visionaries have talked about in terms of the changing healthcare, driving more of our patients, high acuity patients, to our ambulatory network. And this was the result. And we were focusing on the main hospital. We're a 60-location, vertically integrated, all-employee pediatric hospital, academic medical center. But we needed to look at the high acuity inpatient beds. And we actually did 4 growth scenarios, one of which was what we called a negative growth. We couldn't come up with any good name for it, but it was what happens if we have fewer beds. And we analyzed that. And in the lower left, you see every space typology in a time sequence over a 21-year period, and its growth pattern based on our best projections. And we identified 3 key drivers that would cause us to need new high acuity inpatient space. The first was if we had growth in our inpatient environment in excess of 1% over the first 14 years. So if we grew any faster than 1% 1% a year over the first 14 years, we would need most likely a new patient tower. The second was some of the things if you've heard already here today, if we needed to transition from the 35% high acuity ICU type beds to say more than 50% or even 65% ICU beds, which we think will happen to us, that most likely would also trigger the need for probably again a new patient tower. And then the third was that if we either from a clinical perspective or a market forces competitive perspective or even a regulatory requirement were driven towards 100% all private inpatient beds, that would certainly require a new ambulatory pavilion. So the good news is that we identified those things, and since the growth one is the only one that's necessary from a time perspective, we backed into that, and we're actually starting the planning of that new pavilion right now. But again, we anticipated all the same questions from our board. If you do that, what are you giving up, and what would you prevent us from doing otherwise? So we really needed that iterative tool. And enter CAS 2.0. All of our inpatient space. Essentially what we thought we needed was SimCity for CHOP. Anybody know what SimCity is? We started calling it SimCHOP and then gravitated towards CAS 2. And the key to that for us was identifying the variables that are important to us. And some of those variables are on the screen. Total square footage through the enterprise in the inpatient setting, department gross square footage, and what I think are the most important, we started calling our buildings buckets that we could fill, and the real estate guys in the room appreciate that. The clinicians didn't. Every space typology had a utilization prioritization algorithm. In other words, where was it best located for itself? And then probably equally important to me was every building or bucket had a utilization prioritization algorithm in terms of what the highest and best use to put in it was, because we have research buildings that cost us $800 a square foot. We have, inpatient towers that cost us $1,200 a square foot, and we have office buildings that cost us $300 a square foot. That's how we define suboptimization, is when we put a lower use in a high infrastructure building. And then we were also able to do cost to create, time to create, and the cost of core and shell used. And then the most difficult thing, as everybody's already been talking about, was getting the contribution margin by service line and space typology from our finance people. And it wasn't because they didn't want to do it. But they really partnered with us to identify that. This is not a financial planning tool, but we wanted to be able to at least answer the question, does this give us a higher or lower contribution margin scenario on a scenario? So what we're able to do is actually generate reports. First of all, we can do infinite number of scenario analyses. And there's a good example of a dashboard that we get from the utilization algorithm. So we're able to actually play with that, essentially a Monte Carlo simulation for our space that allows us to say, what is the best fit for these parameters? And then we can tinker with it, no matter how small the change, we can play with it and understand what the variation off of best fit is. And we can do that for the utilization algorithm. In other words, how close to best fit do we have for any particular scenario that we might choose? And how much, and this is the one I really get excited about, what percentage of our core and shell infrastructure is underutilized, right? So we can optimize both of those things. So, and then finally, we can look at the contribution margin that results from any of these plans. So we were delighted with the fact that we could do this, and we anticipate that this will help us communicate every single next project that we want to do in the context of a best fit scenario over time. And I started with a Greek mythology example, and I'll end with a Buddhist concept of nirvana. My team loves to make fun of me because I'm always saying, you have to define what nirvana is, and then let's see how close we can get to it. I don't think it's achievable here on Earth, but for a facilities guy, that's how I define nirvana. Nirvana, for me, is when you've reflected the right variables in how you iterate your capital assets. Nirvana, for me, is when you've been able to execute a plan that actually is optimizing every space typology and putting it in the right place. And then nirvana for me is when every square foot of your space is being used at the highest and best possible use that it can support without any waste. There was a Toyota guy earlier, Toyota production system, eliminate waste, right? And what we think that CAS 2.0 does for us is it doesn't just identify what the next step is, it identifies what the right next step is. And it allows you to continuously identify what the right next step is for every step in your journey. So from our perspective, CAS 2.0 moves us a little bit closer to nirvana. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.